All right. There's a lot of you. Did you all come for the wombats? I hope you did. All right. Thanks for closing the door. Awesome. So my name is Irina. I write in JavaScript, if you can tell by the amount of JavaScript stickers on my laptop. And you can find me on the interwebs. Today I'll be talking about building interactive command line modules because that's what I like doing, and it's lots of fun for me for my side projects as well as writing those for work. And we'll cover lots of things. So what's a command line module? Essentially, it's a program that you write for a user to interact with through your terminal or your command prompt. The ones you're probably familiar are make directory, git init, and maybe we're not being very responsive, sorry. Or npm init, all command line modules. So what would you be using those for? If you're the one writing it or you've written one before, you'll be likely writing it for a cron job or compiling certain script or maybe writing an abstract way to access your API from the command line. And who will be using such magic that you write? Mostly your team. Could be just for yourself, or you could be doing it for the open source community in general. And basically, when you would write it, kind of gets you into this kind of mind thinking that's different from when you write it on the web. So most of the side projects I work on tend to evolve around command line or include a command line extension to it if I write just a general module. Which is why I'm here to talk about interactivity within your own command line projects. Programming for me is very similar to making art in a sense that it's a creative process that requires shaping, creating, and building to get to a final product. And to make such a successful art piece, we often have to place limitations on ourselves to actually get creative. Otherwise, we're kind of stuck with 179 options of salad dressing, which leaves us in kind of state of frenzy. And so that means that when we're faced to work on a task for the web side of things for our project, the sheer possibility of such can become very limiting and very stressful just because you have so many options. So then you're faced with this paradox of choice. Which is why it's so incredibly interesting to work with command line interface, because you're limited to one screen. You're working with a limited set of colors. You can't have fancy buttons you would have on the web. And the fact that you're not working with a browser is quite refreshing. Working with command line allows you to limit yourself and then get creative to work around certain aspects and to get them to work. And once again, on a browser, you're going to get 179 ways of doing certain things, and on the command line, there's just one. And which is why it's so important to be able to build an experience within that program that you're writing for the CLI, to be able to provide for other folks to use it, which sometimes we might not be able to think of that next step when we write such a program. So how do we accomplish such an experience on the command line? As programmers, our job does not just consist of writing code and making sure that the code is readable. It's also our job to write code that renders our programs usable, and which means that when we're writing them for the command line, they also should be usable. So we should be putting whoever is going to use that particular program that we write, again, whether it's for the web or for the command line, first, whether it'll be your team, the community, or even you, even if you're the only user, kind of put yourself first. Otherwise, you kind of get stuck in terms of being lost as to what's happening within. This is fresh off the web. Otherwise, you're kind of lost as to what's happening in terms of your experience. So when talking about such experience, having written different types of ways, I came up with a little guide for myself that I would like to share with you. And I called it the Irina's Guide for Writing Interactive Command Line Modules. I tend to plan a lot of things, which is why this is a list. I make a lot of lists of things and post them on GitHub and stuff. So this is going to be a little bit of a list. Not necessarily in the order that you should be doing that, but just kind of the order I go by. And it's not like an ordered list, even though it's got numbers around it. So number one is design your program. And when I say design, I don't mean just the look of it, which could be part of this process, but mainly designing how your program will function and how or which kind of things it will tackle. A lot of planning for me has to do with the program design itself, so how the code is going to function, which parts of the code are going to do what. And for me, kind of planning out which components do what. So a lot of that process comes down to dealing with the Linux during a presentation. A lot of that comes down to this particular code, because that's kind of how I feel that building a program that follows the Unix design principles makes it a lot more easier for the end user to deal with. And that's kind of what I go by when I do my first step of designing that particular program. And I guess to get into this a little bit more, I want to talk about some of the design patterns that the Unix philosophy follows when dealing with a command line interface. There is a bunch of them. These are not the only 4. I think there's about 10. But these are kind of the basic ones that we would be using in our day-to-day operations. So there's something called filter, which basically all it does is takes an input, processes it based on some of the criteria, and then produces the output. grep, sort, tr does that kind of thing. Something I've written as my very, very first command line module was called wombat.js, and all it does is it takes a string, my input, and puts back an ASCII representation of a wombat and the string back. So little filter and a wombat, which makes me very happy. Another one is source. It takes no input, and output is based on startup conditions or the current conditions. PS is pretty simple one. Startup condition is the process that is happening in the current state, and it displays whatever the process that is happening. Probably use PSAUX more often than just PS. Cantrip, which I sometimes call catnip, takes no input, no output, and is just like an invocation of a current of a program. Migdir is one of them, just creates a directory. And in, for example, some of the projects that we may be working on, or I've worked on, a lot of the stuff that I write deals with scrapers that I then make into cron jobs, or things like that. Basically, in this particular example, I used VDC scan, and the scanning portion of things would just invoke the scanning function, which would just invoke a scraper to be run, and that kind of thing. And ed pattern, which is basically quite different from the previous ones we've done before. It's built in the interactive process of things, which the other ones just took an input or took no input and provided an output. This one allows the user to interact more with stuff, which is a really interesting pattern to use once you want to build more interactive applications within the command line. So you're able to, using this pattern, you're able to gain control of the information passed during the startup time, and it's separate from the data. And basically, it's driven by the interaction that the user provides. So that was a lot of Unix stuff. So let's take a wombat break. Okay, so using these patterns helps us, I think, design better programs that are then could be taken and interacted with by the user. These are just 4 examples, like I said. There's about 10 more of those that we would be able to use once we put those together. And when you design these kind of patterns or design these CLI interactions, you're able to work with these Unix CLI patterns to be able to create better programs or sub-programs within the tools you're building. Step number 2 of building awesome CLI interactions is asking for help. And by help, I mean looking at the tools that are available to use for you when you're building a command line module. So it's the tools that you normally wouldn't have that basically help you out, and you don't have to do all the dirty work like cleaning up your laundry and stuff. These tools are available, and some of the other steps I'll be talking about use these tools to be able to help you make an interactive program. So 3 is using options. So when you create a program, you're often using options for people to use, and I think that's pretty essential, because otherwise you're just writing / and running your index.js file. But with options, you're able to provide certain parameters for the user to be able to interact with. And instead of having to work with those on your own, there's plenty available for you. These are just like the 4 that fit on a slide, but there's a thing more. So they parse those options for you. And you can't see that at all. So basically, this is a program I was working on that allows the user to interact, to text through the command line. And I've set up 3 different commands that they would be able to use, and some of the options they would be able to pass. But instead of kind of looking at the process.argv, I used yargs mainly for its pirate speak documentation to parse out whatever the options the user might provide. And that kind of gives the user an experience that they're able to pass certain things, and you can build it out with your own program. So in the wombat example, it was wombat-y, y being the option, and whatever I pass in being the string, and that outputs the wombat. But you can take it a step further. So options are the -y, -b you would normally use. But I think a lot of the times that's very difficult for the user to read as to what is -y, what does it stand for. So sometimes you should be able to use like a more verbose option that's a lot more easier to read. Or you could use a command in general. So if you're able to abstract that module that you work with and, for example, use text config and set up the config using some of the interactiveness of the config option, you can work with that instead. And I think, again, config being a lot easier to understand than -c, because what does -c stand for? Is it config? Is it cats? Is it catnip? You kind of don't know. So something to be aware of is that the user might not be able to, this is not their, this is their first command line that they use, and -c is not very, it's not very descriptive. And similar to -c, you can maybe provide a verbose option, which would be -- config or something like that. And then it's nice and also understandable to read. Yeah, so getting help, it's nice to get by with a little help from the friends or the tools that are available for you. And it's also another thing is I like sometimes setting up defaults for argument parsing. So for example, a file that you would be able to read instead of getting the user to always pass in the file. If you have a default file that you could use that's already set up as a default, so the user doesn't always have to provide it. 3, prompts. Prompts are really awesome, actually, because then you're able to, instead of providing an option every time or getting the user to provide the option every time, you can do that within the shell. And there's several different options. There is the Flatirons prompt, which is really cool, and it looks like that in real life, which is really crappy to see too. So basically, you're just kind of asking, and I'm providing yes as a default, which was mentioned previously. And all I'm asking them if whether or not they want a yes or a no based on the previous question. So prompt is nice. You get the input from the user within the shell, and they're kind of interacting with it. There's promzard, which is, I think, Isaac's module that you can run a file through if you have multiple questions for the user to answer, like what's your config file, what's your name, and I've used it like that previously, where I ask for the Twilio authentication tokens and SIDs and things like that, I would then store in a file because it outputs it as a JSON. And Enquirer is super, super awesome because somebody actually mentioned this to me during JSConf, and it allows you to work through different options in the command line interface and pick the items you want to do, so you can actually go back and forth instead of, again, providing that into the options or the commands of the particular module you're working with. And so basically, when you're working with those things, it's really easy. It's nice for you to be able to help your user and prompt them and guide them through the process you're taking them through, instead of kind of just jumping them with options, because that could get your user to pull away or kind of quit your program when they should be guided through. Another thing is errors. I log your errors so then the user knows what's happening. So you don't leave them hanging, and if they should know what's up rather than having like your program blow up in their face. Whether it's just on air or at the end of the particular program you're running, just letting them know that something is up. And given those errors, you can color code them so that it all doesn't look white, because that's kind of crappy too, because then it just blends in. Then you can output different things in different colors. And the most important thing, I think, is being able to build your modules with empathy. I think we forget a lot about that, is that we just build these as a cron job for the rest of our team to use, but we don't put a lot of effort into making sure that our teammates are able to use it in a proper fashion, or that they would be able to understand what you were going through when you were building that. Because we're not building this for the web, we kind of sometimes don't think about the user. And we also should be thinking about the fact that maybe all of our teammates are on a Mac, but a lot of the times they aren't, and we should be able to kind of step into other people's shoes when building these kind of programs, and guiding them through our product and making sure that they are able to interact with it the way they would be able to, or as close of an approximation on the website. So thanks so much for listening. I got like 1 second. Yeah, this is awesome. Thanks.